The first thing I heard that morning was a notification I didn't understand, and by the time I finished reading it, my family had already lost land that had been in our name for more than 40 years. I remember standing in my kitchen in Denver, Colorado, coffee still warm in my hand, staring at the screen like it was written in a language I should recognize but couldn't process fast enough. It said the ownership of Carter family land, a 12-acre property just outside town, had been transferred. Not pending, not in review. Completed. I told myself there had to be a mistake, because land like that doesn't just change hands overnight, especially not land my father used to walk every summer, pointing out where fences needed repair and where the soil still held the memory of everything we built on it. My name is John Carter. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my life I believe that if something carried your family name long enough, it became untouchable, like history itself was a kind of protection. That belief ended the moment I saw a signature on a document that didn't belong to me. At first I thought it was a clerical error, something the county office would correct in a day, but then I noticed the file number, the timestamp, and most importantly, the name next to the authorization line. Emily Carter, my wife. I stood there longer than I should have, not because I didn't understand what I was reading, but because I couldn't understand how it could be real. Emily and I had built what I thought was a stable life, nothing extravagant, just steady, a home in a quiet neighborhood, a shared account we both contributed to, and that land outside town that we always called the future, a place we promised ourselves we would preserve no matter what changed in life. I walked over to the window without even realizing it, looking out at the street as if the answer would be written somewhere between the passing cars and morning commuters. Everything looked normal, almost insultingly normal, like nothing in the world had shifted except mine. When Emily came downstairs that morning, she was calm, too calm in a way I only recognized later, the kind of calm people have when they already know how a conversation will end. She asked me if I wanted coffee, the same way she always did, like nothing was different, and I remember hearing my own voice respond without emotion, asking her if she had signed anything related to the land. For a fraction of a second, she paused just long enough for me to notice it. Then she said yes, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She told me it was a strategic decision, something about simplifying assets, reducing tax exposure, preparing for long-term stability. Her words were structured, rehearsed even, the kind of explanation you give when you've already decided not to invite disagreement. I remember sitting down slowly at the kitchen table because standing suddenly felt like too much effort, like the weight of what she was saying had physical mass. The land wasn't just property to me, it was memory, inheritance, the last remaining piece of my father's legacy that hadn't been divided, sold, or repurposed. And yet here she was describing its transfer like she was talking about switching utility providers. I asked her who she sold it to, and she said it wasn't about selling, it was about repositioning, a phrase I had never heard her use before. That was the first moment I felt something shift, not anger, not panic, but a quiet certainty that I was missing a piece of a story that had already been in motion long before that morning. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse her of anything, I just listened, because something about the way she avoided my eyes told me that whatever came next wouldn't be resolved by emotion. And in that silence, while the coffee cooled between us and the house stayed perfectly still, I realized I was no longer looking at a misunderstanding. I was looking at a decision I was never included in. Emily did not leave the kitchen after that conversation. She simply finished her coffee and acted as if the subject had already been closed. But I could feel that something fundamental had shifted between us, like a line had been crossed without permission and there was no obvious way to step back over it. I spent the next hour sitting at the same table, replaying every word she had used, especially the calmness in her voice when she confirmed she had signed the documents. Because it was not the language of confusion or mistake, it was the language of intention. When she finally left for what she called a routine appointment, I waited until I heard the garage door close before I picked up my laptop and searched the county property records myself, entering every identifier I had memorized from the notice I received. The system loaded slowly, and for a moment I convinced myself that I would see some correction, some administrative delay, something that restored the world I understood. Instead, I saw a full transfer record, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier than the notification I received, which meant this process had been active in silence long before I ever became aware of it. The name listed as the new controlling entity was not a private buyer as Emily had implied, but a limited liability company registered out of state, with a generic name that revealed nothing about intent or ownership, and that detail alone made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. I called the county office immediately, speaking as calmly as I could manage, asking for clarification about authorization procedures, and the clerk on the line explained that the transfer had been executed with a notarized signature and supporting documentation that appeared valid under state requirements, which meant on paper nothing looked wrong even if everything felt wrong. After I ended the call, I sat in silence for several minutes, not because I was stuck, but because I was trying to understand how something so irreversible could be created with so little visibility. I kept thinking about the land itself, about the fence line my father and I repaired when I was 16, about the way he used to say that land does not forget who cared for it. And now that same land had been reassigned without my knowledge, as if memory had no legal weight. By late afternoon, I decided I needed answers that did not come from documents alone. So I drove to the office listed on one of the filings, a small administrative building downtown with no signage that matched the scale of what had happened. Inside, the atmosphere was routine, almost indifferent, as if people came in every day to process ownership changes that altered entire family histories. I asked to speak with someone responsible for the transfer file, and after a short wait, a man in his 50s came out holding a folder that already looked familiar to him. He confirmed that everything had been executed according to standard procedure, but when I pressed him about Emily Carter specifically, I noticed a subtle shift in his tone, a hesitation that suggested he recognized the name beyond routine paperwork. He did not say much, but he mentioned that there had been a consultation involving a private legal advisor prior to the filing, and that the structure of the transaction had been designed to minimize visibility rather than maximize simplicity, which contradicted everything Emily had told me at home. I left the building with copies of documents I did not fully understand yet, but I understood enough to know that this was not a single decision made in a single moment. It was a sequence of steps carefully arranged over time. That night, when Emily returned home, I did not confront her immediately because I needed to observe whether she would maintain consistency in her version of events. She walked in carrying groceries, speaking casually about traffic and weather as if nothing beyond the kitchen mattered, and I watched her closely while she moved around the house, looking for any sign of hesitation or discomfort. When I finally mentioned that I had visited the county office, her expression changed only slightly, but enough for me to notice that she had not expected that level of verification so quickly. She told me again that everything was part of financial planning, that I was overreacting to administrative adjustments, and that the land was still within the family structure even if the structure itself had evolved. But the words no longer aligned with what I had already seen, and for the first time I understood that the explanation I was being given was not meant to inform me, it was meant to stabilize me. Later that night, I opened a folder on my computer and began organizing every document in chronological order, noticing patterns in timing, signatures, and references to a legal instrument I had not yet fully identified, but which appeared repeatedly across filings. And in that quiet process, without any dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, I began to see the outline of something far more deliberate than I had initially imagined. The more I reviewed the documents, the more I realized that what I was looking at was not a single transfer event, but a structured sequence of legal steps designed with precision, and that realization changed the way I read every page that followed. The language repeated itself in subtle variations, references to authorization frameworks, third-party facilitation, and something labeled as asset restructuring protocol, a phrase I had never heard in our household conversations before. I spent the entire next morning cross-checking names, registration numbers, and filing timestamps, building a timeline that no longer felt like speculation, but instead felt like reconstruction of something already completed. By midday, I understood that I could not make sense of this alone, so I contacted a real estate attorney in downtown Denver whose name appeared repeatedly in public case records involving property disputes. When I arrived at his office, I brought printed copies of everything I had gathered, and I remember placing them on his desk in chronological order as if organizing them would make the situation less complex than it was. He reviewed them quietly for several minutes without speaking, which in itself increased my sense of uncertainty, because silence from someone experienced often carries more meaning than immediate explanation. Finally, he leaned back and asked me a question I did not expect, whether my wife had ever mentioned establishing a trust or any form of structured ownership separation. I told him no, or at least nothing that had been clearly explained to me in those terms. And that was when he began to shift the pages slightly, pointing out references I had overlooked. He explained that what I was seeing was consistent with a layered ownership arrangement, where the property itself is no longer directly held by individuals, but instead controlled through a separate legal entity, which in this case appeared to have been created months earlier under circumstances that did not require my direct consent if certain conditions had been met. I asked him how that could be possible without my knowledge, and he explained that in many cases it depends on pre-existing authorization documents that grant limited decision-making authority, sometimes embedded within broader marital financial agreements that people sign without fully understanding long-term implications. As he spoke, I found myself thinking not only about the land, but about every conversation Emily and I had over the past year that involved financial planning, conversations I had treated as routine discussions rather than structural changes. He then asked me if I had ever signed anything related to power of attorney or asset management delegation, and I initially said no. But then I remembered a set of documents from nearly 18 months earlier during a refinancing discussion where multiple forms were signed quickly in an office we visited after work. At the time, I had trusted the process, assuming it was standard procedure, and I did not request individual clarification for each page because everything appeared to align with our shared financial goals. Now, sitting across from the attorney, that memory felt significantly heavier than it had ever felt before. He explained that if such authority had been granted, even partially, it could explain how certain actions were executed without direct notification, especially if combined with external advisory input. When I left his office, I was not angry yet, but I was no longer operating under the assumption that this situation was simple misunderstanding. Instead, I was beginning to see structure where I had previously seen coincidence, and intent where I had assumed convenience. That evening, I decided to observe Emily more carefully, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that would allow me to understand whether her behavior aligned with the documentation I had now reviewed. She returned home slightly later than usual, mentioning a meeting related to financial planning services, a phrase that now immediately caught my attention in a way it never had before. I asked her casually what kind of planning she was referring to, and she explained it as long-term optimization of family assets, using language that sounded rehearsed but consistent with what I had already seen in legal filings. The difference this time was that I was no longer accepting explanations at surface level. After dinner, I returned to my office and began reconstructing everything again from the beginning, not just the property transfer, but every financial decision we had made in the past 2 years, and I started identifying gaps where external influence or documentation might have entered the process without my active awareness. Among those gaps, I found repeated references to a single document identifier that appeared across multiple unrelated filings, and it was this repetition that finally suggested to me that there was one central instrument controlling everything I had been trying to understand separately. And as I sat there in the quiet of my office, I realized that the situation was no longer about a single piece of land being transferred, but about an entire framework of ownership that had been constructed gradually, patiently, and in a way that I had never been invited to fully see. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of continuity that did not match the situation I was in, as if my mind had not fully accepted what the documents were already telling me. And for a brief moment, I found myself going through routine motions like making coffee and checking emails as though nothing fundamental had changed. But the moment I sat down at my desk and reopened the compiled file of records, that illusion disappeared completely. The repeated identifier I had noticed the night before was still there, and this time I traced it more carefully, moving line by line through scanned copies, certified filings, and third-party confirmations until I saw a pattern that was no longer possible to ignore. Every major change connected to the property was tied back to a single legal instrument, a document referenced only by code rather than name in most public entries, which meant it had been designed to operate quietly within the system without drawing attention. I called the attorney again, this time sending him the specific reference number I had isolated, and within an hour he asked me to come in immediately, because he had identified something significant. When I arrived, he was already waiting with additional printed records he had pulled from a private legal database. And without much preamble, he told me that what we were dealing with was not a simple property transfer or even a standard trust arrangement, but something closer to a layered authorization structure that allowed certain decisions to be executed through delegated consent chains. He explained that in such structures, control is not always visible in one signature or one form, but distributed across multiple approvals that, when combined, produce legal authority without requiring direct, repeated confirmation from all parties involved. As he spoke, I found myself thinking back to the period when Emily had encouraged me to streamline our financial accounts and reduce what she called administrative friction, language I had interpreted at the time as practical organization rather than structural redesign. The attorney then placed a highlighted page in front of me and pointed to a clause that referenced contingent authorization, a term that allowed certain predefined actions to be executed under specific conditions without additional notification. That was the moment I realized that the absence of communication I had been interpreting as normal was actually a built-in feature of the structure itself. I asked him directly whether this meant the transfer of the land could still be reversed, and he did not answer immediately, which told me more than any direct statement could. Instead, he explained that reversal would depend entirely on whether the initial conditions under which authorization was granted were valid, informed, and properly disclosed at the time of agreement, which meant everything now depended on documentation I had signed years earlier without understanding its downstream implications. Leaving his office, I no longer felt uncertainty in the same way as before, because uncertainty implies lack of information, and what I now had was too much information arranged in a way that was beginning to form a coherent picture. On the drive home, I replayed every conversation with Emily over the past several months, not looking for emotional meaning, but for structural cues, moments where language shifted from shared decision-making to guided approval, and I began to notice how often she had framed financial discussions as long-term optimization rather than immediate change. When I arrived home, she was already there, sitting at the kitchen island reviewing papers on her tablet, and for the first time I noticed how often she checked documents rather than simply living within them. She looked up and asked how my morning was, and I answered carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing about what I had discovered, because I needed to understand not just what had happened, but how she would respond when she realized I was no longer accepting explanations at face value. We spoke briefly about ordinary things, schedules, errands, plans for the week, but underneath every sentence was a parallel awareness that the foundation of those conversations had changed. After she went upstairs, I returned to my office and began a new analysis, this time focusing not on the land itself, but on the structure of decision-making that had led to its transfer, mapping every step like a timeline that no longer felt abstract but deliberately constructed. And as the pattern became clearer, I understood that what I had been treating as a single event was actually the final visible point of a process that had been developing quietly for a long time, guided by documentation I had not fully understood and decisions I had unknowingly participated in. By the time I reached the middle of that week, my understanding of what had happened to our land was no longer based on isolated documents, but on a connected structure of decisions, each one reinforcing the next like parts of a system I had unknowingly stepped into years ago. I began reconstructing every financial conversation I had ever had with Emily, not emotionally, but chronologically, as if I were trying to debug a process that had been running in the background of my life without my awareness. What I noticed was that the language had changed gradually over time, never in a way that felt alarming in the moment, but clearly directional in hindsight. Phrases like streamlining ownership, future flexibility, and reducing friction between shared assets appeared repeatedly in conversations I once considered routine, and I realized now that those phrases were not casual suggestions, but structured signals tied to legal actions I had not fully understood. I returned to the attorney again, bringing with me a refined timeline of every interaction I could remember, and he reviewed it quietly before pointing out something I had not seen on my own. He said that in cases like this, the real control point is rarely the final transaction, but the earlier consent framework that allows multiple future actions to be executed under predefined conditions without requiring repeated approval. That explanation changed the way I interpreted everything that had happened, because it meant the land transfer was not an isolated decision, but the final visible output of a system that had been activated long before I noticed anything unusual. When I asked him who typically initiates such frameworks in practice, he avoided speculation but made one thing clear. Whoever introduced the structure usually understands it at a level the other party does not. I did not need him to elaborate further, because at that point the implication was already forming in my mind without resistance. That evening, I came home earlier than usual, not because I wanted confrontation, but because I wanted observation under controlled conditions. Emily was in the living room reviewing what she described as portfolio adjustments on her tablet, and when I asked her simple questions about recent financial changes, her answers remained consistent, calm, and carefully aligned with the explanations she had given before. But I started noticing something different in how she paused between sentences, as if she was mentally verifying whether each response matched an internal record I did not have access to. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs, but instead of disengaging, I began a second level of review, focusing specifically on timing correlations between her communications and every document filing I had recovered. What emerged was a pattern of synchronization that could not reasonably be attributed to coincidence, where key legal actions consistently followed private discussions about financial optimization by a predictable margin of days or weeks. That pattern forced me to reconsider not just what had been done, but how long the entire process had been active without my explicit recognition. The next morning, I requested a full historical copy of all property-related filings from the county archive, including any preliminary submissions that might not appear in standard summaries. And when I received the expanded packet, I found additional references that had previously been omitted from the simplified reports I had first reviewed. One of those references pointed to a supplementary authorization layer that had been filed under a variation of Emily's legal name with a different middle initial, something subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless someone was specifically searching for inconsistencies. I brought this discovery back to the attorney, and for the first time his expression shifted from analytical calm to focused attention, because this detail suggested intentional segmentation of identity within legal documentation. He explained that such segmentation is not common in standard marital asset planning, and is typically used only when multiple decision pathways need to remain operational under different conditions. At that moment, I stopped thinking in terms of confusion and started thinking in terms of design. When I returned home that night, Emily asked me if I had made progress on my inquiries, and I told her I was still trying to understand how everything had been structured, without revealing the specific discoveries I had made. She nodded as if that answer was acceptable, but I noticed she did not ask what specifically I had learned, which itself felt like a form of restraint rather than curiosity. Later, when the house was quiet, I sat alone in my office and organized every piece of information again, not looking for emotional closure, but for structural certainty, and I realized that what I was dealing with was no longer a single act of misdirection, but a long-term system that had been operating through incremental consent, layered documentation, and carefully controlled information flow that I had only recently begun to see in full. After identifying the segmentation in the legal structure, I began to realize that the problem was not simply about what had been done, but about how deeply the system had been embedded into ordinary decisions I had made without resistance. The attorney's explanation about layered authorization kept replaying in my mind, especially the idea that control does not need to be visible at the moment of action if it has already been granted in advance through structured consent. That concept forced me to reevaluate every signature I had ever treated as routine, including the refinancing period Emily had mentioned more than once as a necessary step toward financial flexibility. I pulled out archived emails from that period and began reading them line by line, noticing how often language of efficiency and optimization was paired with requests for quick approval or minimal review. At the time, I had interpreted those moments as trust within a partnership, but now they appeared as carefully timed entry points for long-term structural changes. I returned once again to the attorney's office with updated records, and this time he brought in a colleague who specialized in property governance structures, someone who immediately recognized the segmentation pattern I had previously observed. She explained that when multiple authorization layers are embedded under slightly varied identity formats, It is often done to ensure continuity of execution even if one layer is challenged or questioned, which effectively creates redundancy in decision authority. Hearing that, I realized that the system was not only designed for execution, but also for resilience against reversal. That afternoon, I spent several hours comparing all known filings side by side, and I began to see that each layer of documentation was not independent, but interconnected through references that were intentionally indirect rather than explicit. This made it increasingly clear that the transfer of the land was not the beginning of the process, nor even a midpoint, but simply the final outward expression of a much older framework already in motion. When I returned home that evening, Emily was preparing dinner, and the normalcy of the scene felt almost incompatible with everything I had learned during the day. She asked me about my meetings in a casual tone, and I responded carefully, avoiding any language that would reveal the depth of what I had discovered. What struck me most was how stable she remained in her demeanor, as if nothing in our shared reality had shifted at all, even though I now understood that the underlying structure of that reality was no longer what I believed it to be. After dinner, I received a call from the attorney, who informed me that additional records had been pulled from a secondary registry linked to the same property chain, and that these records contained references to conditional execution clauses that could significantly affect ownership interpretation if properly challenged. I drove back to his office immediately, and when I arrived, he showed me a newly printed set of documents that had not been included in my earlier requests. One page in particular contained a reference that connected the entire structure back to a single originating agreement, a document that predated most of the actions I had been analyzing. He pointed out that this originating agreement was likely the foundation upon which every subsequent authorization had been built, meaning that the entire sequence I had been tracing was dependent on a single foundational consent structure. As I left the office that night, I no longer felt like I was uncovering separate incidents, but instead recognizing a single continuous mechanism that had been operating across time. When I got home, Emily was already asleep, and I stood for a moment in the hallway, aware that the silence of the house now carried a different weight. I did not wake her because I understood that the situation was no longer about immediate confrontation, but about fully mapping the extent of what had already been established before any decision about response could even be considered. That night did not feel like a continuation of the day before, but rather like a shift in the way time itself was being experienced, because once you begin to see structure behind events, even ordinary silence starts to feel like part of a larger system. I stayed awake longer than usual, sitting in my office with the documents arranged in front of me in layers, not because I expected a sudden breakthrough, but because I understood that clarity would come from repetition and comparison rather than a single discovery. The originating agreement the attorney had identified kept pulling my attention back, not because of what it said directly, but because of what it implied about everything that followed it. If that document truly established the foundation of authority, then every action taken afterward was not independent, but derivative, and that realization forced me to reconsider the entire timeline of my financial life with Emily from the moment we had first combined our assets. I opened older records, including tax filings, shared account summaries, and even early mortgage documents, not expecting to find something new, but instead looking for consistency in how decisions were framed and executed. What I found was a repeated pattern of delegation language that I had previously ignored, phrases that suggested ongoing consent rather than isolated approval, and that distinction changed the entire meaning of what I had signed years earlier. The next morning, I returned to the attorney's office with a question I had been avoiding, not about what had happened, but about whether there was any point in the process where the structure could be challenged without triggering immediate legal resistance. He listened carefully, then explained that the only meaningful point of challenge would be to examine the validity of the original consent framework, which meant proving that the conditions under which I had agreed to those terms were not fully understood or adequately disclosed. That answer was not simple, because it meant the focus was no longer on the land itself, but on the circumstances of agreement that existed long before the land transfer ever occurred. He then asked me to recall the exact context in which I had signed the refinancing and asset consolidation documents, and as I described it, I began to remember details I had previously considered irrelevant, including the presence of multiple documents presented together limited explanation time, and the framing of the process as standard financial housekeeping. Those memories now felt different, not because they had changed, but because I was interpreting them through a new understanding of their purpose. Later that afternoon, I requested copies of every related document from both the county archive and the financial institution involved in the refinancing, and when they arrived, I spent hours cross-referencing signatures, timestamps, and reference codes until a clearer structure emerged. It became evident that the authorization system was not linear but layered, meaning that each signature did not simply approve a single action, but activated a chain of conditional permissions that could be executed later without additional confirmation. That realization was difficult to process because it meant that my understanding of consent at the time had been fundamentally incomplete, not due to deception in a single moment, but due to complexity that had not been fully explained or understood. When Emily returned home that evening, I was already reviewing the documents again, and she immediately noticed the difference in my focus, though she did not ask direct questions. Instead, she spoke about her day in financial terms again, mentioning portfolio adjustments and long-term restructuring, and I found myself listening differently than before, not emotionally, but analytically, comparing her language to the terminology used in the documents I had been studying. There was a consistency in phrasing that now stood out in a way it had not previously, as if her vocabulary and the legal structure I was uncovering were drawn from the same framework. After she went upstairs, I received an email from the attorney containing additional analysis of the originating agreement, and in it he noted that the document appeared to include provisions that allowed for adaptive execution based on predefined financial conditions, which effectively meant that once certain thresholds were met, actions could proceed automatically within the structure without further input. Reading that, I understood that the situation was not about a single act of transfer or even a sequence of actions, but about a system designed to function continuously once initiated. I sat in silence for a long time after finishing the email, not because I was confused, but because I was beginning to see the full scale of what had been constructed over time, and that understanding required me to reconsider not only what had happened to the land, but how deeply embedded the framework had become within the assumptions I had used to make decisions for years. By the time I reached the end of that week, the entire structure I had been reconstructing no longer felt like separate layers of legal complexity, but instead like a single continuous framework that had been operating beneath my life for years without interruption. I stopped thinking in terms of isolated mistakes or misunderstandings, because nothing in the documentation suggested randomness, only progression. Each layer of authorization, each conditional clause, and each referenced agreement pointed back toward a central originating structure that had defined the boundaries of every decision that followed. I spent most of that morning in silence, not because I had nothing to do, but because I needed to process the fact that every assumption I had made about shared ownership had been based on incomplete visibility. Later that day, I met with the attorney again, and this time he did not begin with explanations, but with confirmation that he had completed a full reconstruction of the legal chain tied to the property and associated assets. He placed a single printed diagram on the desk, showing how the originating agreement branched into multiple execution paths, each one capable of triggering specific actions under predefined conditions without requiring direct renewed consent. As I studied it, I realized that what I had interpreted as individual decisions made over time were actually synchronized outcomes of a system designed to operate continuously once activated. The attorney then explained that the most critical aspect of such systems is not the execution itself, but the threshold conditions that determine when execution becomes valid, because those conditions are often embedded within documents signed years earlier under different assumptions. That statement forced me to revisit the refinancing period again in my memory, not as a routine financial step, but as a potential activation point I had never understood at the time. When I returned home that evening, Emily was already there, and for the first time I noticed that she had organized a stack of printed financial summaries on the kitchen counter, as if preparing for a structured discussion rather than a casual conversation. She asked me whether I had reached any conclusions, and I answered carefully that I was still reviewing the full scope of documentation, without revealing that I now understood the depth of the system far beyond what she had presented to me. Her expression remained steady, but I noticed a subtle pause before she responded, a hesitation that suggested she was evaluating how much I had discovered rather than simply asking out of curiosity. After dinner, I returned to my office and opened the reconstructed legal map again, focusing not on the endpoints but on the initial triggers that activated the entire structure. What I found was a pattern of conditional clauses tied to financial milestones, marital asset consolidation points, and advisory approvals that together formed a closed system of authority distribution. It became increasingly clear that the land transfer was not an isolated act of loss, but the final visible expression of a framework that had already executed itself in stages long before I became aware of it. The more I studied it, the more I understood that the true center of control was not located in any single document, but in the interaction between them, where each layer validated the next under specific conditions that had already been met. That realization changed the way I viewed every conversation I had ever had with Emily about financial planning, because what once felt like shared decision-making now appeared to be structured alignment with a system already in motion. I did not confront her that night, because I understood that confrontation without full clarity would only create noise rather than resolution. Instead, I continued mapping every element of the structure until the outline became unmistakably complete. And in that completeness, I finally understood that what I had been experiencing was not a single moment of loss, but the final stage of a long-running process that had been built with precision, patience, and complete reliance on documentation I had once signed without fully understanding its long-term implications. By the time I returned to the attorney's office for what I understood would be the final review, the entire situation no longer felt like a sequence of discoveries, but like the closing alignment of a structure that had already reached its endpoint long before I became aware of it. He did not ask me to explain anything this time. Instead, he placed a single document on the table, separate from the rest, and said that if I wanted true clarity, I needed to focus on this one record above all others. It was the originating agreement, but in its complete certified form, including an appendix that had not been part of any previous copies I had reviewed. As I read it slowly, line by line, I realized that the critical detail had never been hidden in complexity, but in placement, because the clause that governed execution authority was conditioned on a requirement that both parties maintain continuous and equal awareness of all material asset changes at the time of each triggering event. The attorney then explained that this condition was not met at the time the land transfer was executed, because the notification chain had been structurally incomplete, meaning that under the exact terms of the agreement itself, the activation threshold had not been validly satisfied. For a moment, I did not respond, not because I did not understand, but because I was realizing that everything I had been treating as irreversible had, in fact, never been legally stabilized in the way I had assumed. He continued, explaining that when conditional frameworks fail to meet their own activation requirements, downstream actions that depend on them become subject to automatic invalidation upon formal review, not through dispute, but through structural noncompliance with their own governing logic. That was the moment I understood that the entire chain I had spent weeks reconstructing did not need to be fought in the way I originally believed, because its foundation contained the mechanism for its own reversal. When I left his office that afternoon, I did not feel triumph or anger, only a quiet recalibration of everything I thought I knew about control, ownership, and decision-making. I drove home without turning on the radio, replaying the wording of that clause in my mind, understanding now that precision in legal language was not decoration, but function. When I arrived, Emily was in the living room again, this time without documents in her hands, and she looked at me in a way that suggested she already understood the direction of my understanding, even if she did not yet know the full extent of what I had discovered. I sat down across from her and told her calmly that I had reviewed the originating agreement in full, including the appendix, and that I now understood why certain actions had been possible and why others had not been properly validated. She did not interrupt, and for the first time since this began, I saw a shift in her expression that was not rehearsed or measured, but reflective, as if she was also reassessing the structure she had believed to be stable. I told her that according to the document itself, the condition required for the land transfer to remain valid had not been met, and therefore the execution chain it relied on was no longer structurally supported. The silence that followed was not emotional in the way I had expected weeks earlier, but procedural, as if both of us were finally standing outside the system rather than inside it. In the days that followed, formal review procedures were initiated through the attorney, and each step confirmed what the originating agreement had already implied. The transfer lacked the required activation conditions, and therefore could not remain legally sustained under its own framework. When the final confirmation arrived stating that the transaction had been reversed according to governing clause enforcement, I did not experience relief in the dramatic sense I once imagined, because the outcome did not feel like a victory over someone else, but like the conclusion of a misunderstanding between structure and perception. Emily and I spoke very little after that, not out of conflict, but because there was nothing left to interpret that had not already been clarified through documentation. In the quiet that followed, I began to understand that what I had been searching for was never simply ownership of land, but certainty in how decisions are made and how easily that certainty can be disrupted when systems are assumed rather than fully understood. And in that understanding, the entire sequence finally resolved not as a story of loss or recovery, but as a reminder that the most decisive outcomes are often determined long before the moment they become visible.